Metroid has a plethora of uncommon enemies, many of which stand out among its peers. But when it comes to bosses, the series is no different. And seeing how the series possesses 150 bosses in total, some of them will end up being less orthodox than the rest. Because of this, today we'll be taking a look at the opposite side of the spectrum with the weirdest Metroid bosses. But let's set our rules first. Any creature that classifies as a unique encounter and that isn't a scripted fight or a risking of an already existing enemy will be taken into consideration. This might seem a bit redundant to mention, but given how we're looking for uncommon bosses, we need to set the rules first to not confuse terms up. With that in mind, what we'll take a look at to determine whether or not a boss sticks out from the rest won't be limited to design or behavior, since we'll also consider backstory and lore if possible. But with that out of the way, let's get started. Starting with Super Metroid, we have a couple of bosses that share some unique properties. When first arriving in Seves, Samus descends to Blue Brinstar to collect both Morph Ball and her first missiles, guarded by a Chozo statue, and, after defeating some space pirates, she makes her way to the bombs. She is greeted with yet another Chozo statue and grabs the bombs, but, as she is making her way outside, the door closes in front of her. The Chozo statue then begins to shed its armor, slowly waking up from its slumber, and, as they open their eye, the fight begins. This creature is known as the Torizo, and they serve as a guardian for the Chozo relics that attack anyone who isn't considered part of the Chozo. This is why almost every statue remains immobile when Samus collects the items they're guarding, since Samus is part Chozo. However, this Torizo in particular activated, and while the reason behind this is unknown, it's theorized that the Torizo went berserk because of the space pirates tinkering with their inner coding, given the other Torizo that can be found later on in the game, but we'll get to that later. The Torizo will attack Samus with its claws and some projectiles similar to the coating they protect items in, its clunky movements suggesting that they're of robotic nature. However, after some shots, their chest will burst open, with a strange liquid pouring from inside, suggesting that they're not entirely robotic, but partly organic as well. But this isn't the only Torizo fight in the game, since prior to collecting the screw attack in Ridley's lair, a golden Torizo will drop from the ceiling. The reason behind its unique coloring remains unknown, but it's most likely to signify its power being greater than normal. After all, the screw attack is one of the most powerful items the Chozo had developed, which means that it requires extra protection. This variant is capable of grabbing Samus' super missiles and throwing them back at her, alongside being able to move much faster in general. The final appearance of a Torizo is in Turian, but not in the form of a boss fight, but rather as a dried out husk, which turns into dust as Samus walks past by it, a result of the baby Metroid's rampage in Turian. This also further supports this theory that the space pirates were able to utilize the Torizo in their favor, since there's no other reason for a Torizo to be in Turian normally. However, this isn't the end for the Torizo nor the Chozo statues, since this next spot is directly related to these creatures. In Metroid Fusion, after Samus collects the Morph Ball, she makes her way to a room where a Chozo statue can be found, holding an item. However, this item is revealed to be the Morph Ball, an item Samus had just collected. And before Samus can do anything, the statue transforms into a Core X. This creature is known as the Elephant Bird, and it confirms that the Torizo are in fact partly biological, since the X are only capable of copying living organisms, which would be impossible if the Torizo were only artificial. The reason why the statues are in the BSL station is unknown, but with this last piece of information and seeing how the BSL station's main purpose is species preservation, this was most likely a Chozo statue taken from SR388 to the BSL station, both because of the BSL station's proximity to SR388 and the theme of this sector in particular, that being trying to replicate SR388's habitat. However, instead of working like a regular Torizo, the X immediately transforms into a Core X, which usually only happens right after defeating an X-infected boss. The reason why the X doesn't use the Torizo as its host and simply transforms is a mystery, and hence why it's on this list. But Elephant Bear isn't the only Chozo statue-related boss from Fusion. When Samus goes back to the main deck after exploring each sector individually, Samus receives a message talking about how the central reactor core is down and how she must make her way there. Once she gets to the reactor's silo, however, the reactor is completely covered in vines, presumably coming from Sector 2. She then finds a way to restore the auxiliary power, but the vegetation remains there, causing issues in the reactor. This is why Samus eventually finds a way to infiltrate the sector from the reactor, but to her surprise, the SIX is waiting for her there. After successfully escaping her, the next stop is the source of the vines that are causing the central reactor core to be down, which is this entry's main interest, Nettori. Nettori is described to be a large plant-like boss created by the X-Parasites, and the source for the vegetation in both the main deck and Sector 2. Its name comes from the combination of needle and Torizo, the first term referring to plants with stinging hairs that may or may not be poisonous, and the latter being the boss we've been talking about in the previous entries. However, this last part is exactly what we're interested in. Just like Elephant Bear, Nettori was most likely taken from SR38 and put into a sector, but the reason why this specimen in particular could be found in Sector 2 Troll is uncertain. Since Sector 2 was meant to research tropical areas, maybe this Chozo statue was transported here to see how it would react to a different climate? But this is definitely a stretch. During the battle, Nettori will take a passive role, standing fully still in place while some plants do the work for it by attacking Samus. However, after a while, its head will fall off, revealing even more vines inside of its body, palpitating while shooting plasma beam shots as a means of self-defense. This most likely indicates that, instead of the statue itself, the vines are probably the driving force of the body that got infected by the X, and the statue is just a host. However, since it's never explained why the X didn't infect the statue itself like they did with Elephant Bear, this boss deserves a spot on this list as well. But there's one more Chozo-related boss that made the list. In Zero Mission, after crashing her ship on Zebes due to some space pirates' ambush, Samus finds herself stranded on Zebes without her suit. She stealthily makes her way through the space pirates' mothership with the help of her paralyzer that, while it doesn't deal damage, it stuns enemies for a brief period of time. After a while, however, she reaches a room with a giant Chozo mural. The screen then shows Samus as a child, then shows herself as an adult, and then a ghostly figure slowly appears on the screen. This is the Ruins Test from Zero Mission. The Ruins Test is a ghost-like creature wearing an armor similar to the Vira suit while holding some sort of orb. The orb will occasionally alter between showing either Samus herself or a hieroglyph that seems to resemble the Ruins Test. Shooting at the orb while projecting Samus will result in her getting damaged, whereas shooting at the glyph will slowly drain the boss's HP. After a while, the Ruins Test will be defeated and go back to the mural, granting her the fully powered suit. This grants Samus all of the items she had collected through the game back, alongside unlocking all the unknown items, the plasma beam, space jump, and gravity suit. However, upon leaving the room, it becomes sealed off and cannot be accessed again for the rest of the game. Now, the origin behind this boss is extremely ambiguous. Given the mural paintings on the wall, the Ruins Test could be a deity for the Chozo of some sorts, supported by the fact that this boss is called Daigunshin, or God of War in Japanese. And adding on to this, its name in English suggests that this spirit was meant to serve as a test for anyone that entered this room, testing to see if they were worthy. This is likely why the room closes after obtaining the suit as well, since the Guardian's purpose was to wait for the chosen one to arrive, that being Samus. However, this is just speculation, and whether it may be a god or just the spirit of a Chozo, like the Chozo ghosts from Prime, both its battle and origin are some of the most unique in the series. Still in Zero Mission, there's yet another boss from this game that made it into the list. After collecting the fully powered suit, Samus makes her way to a large, dark chamber located several rooms behind the vessel's control bridge. There, a gigantic figure slowly creeps its way towards her, its claws making a mechanical noise every step it takes. After a while, the creature makes its presence known. This is Mecha-Ridley. Mecha-Ridley is an incomplete robot built by the Space Pirates. It's missing its flying and walking units, hence why it's connected to some sort of cables that hinder its movement. In battle, Mecha-Ridley will attack Samus with its claws and by shooting both homing missiles coming from a containment place in its back and green lasers coming from its eyes. Mecha-Ridley is fully invincible save for one spot, the chest plate in its chest. After some precise shots to its weak spot, Mecha-Ridley will go down, but not without activating the self-destruction sequence in the mothership first. All that's left is for Samus to escape in one of the Space Pirates' ship and complete her first mission in Seves. However, its most unique trait and the reason why it was chosen for this list is its origin. There's no mention in any future games of this creature whatsoever, and its purpose remains unknown. It was most likely a combat unit based on Ridley, one of the most powerful commanders, in case anything were to happen to him. And this could have been a really threatening enemy had it not been for Samus interfering with the Space Pirates' plan before the robot was completed. However, given how there wasn't any other appearance of this creature in any other game, it was most likely just a prototype, a work in progress, since if there was anything close to the final product, even if it was just the plans themselves, there probably would have been more Mecha-Ridleys created, so this was most likely an experiment to test if combat-based mass-produced robots could work that was dropped due to Samus' actions. But this wasn't the only experiment the Space Pirates tried to conduct that led to a powerful creature being created, since around this time, Project Titan was being performed in Talon 4. To add some context, when Samus first arrives in Phendrana, she comes across the Space Pirates' base. After making her way through the base and collecting the thermal visor, Samus will be able to go through a door that leads to a bridge. After crossing this bridge, Samus will find a giant room filled with snow, with some rocks in the center. Upon closer inspection, these rocks will begin to float, attracting nearby debris, forming Thardus in the process. Thardus is a rock golem created from Phazon by the Space Pirates to use Phazon to create sentient creatures out of inanimate objects. However, Thardus seemed to become too unstable and thus was quarantined in this room, halting the Project Titan indefinitely until they were able to find a way to properly control Thardus. As for this boss's quirk, the fact that a creature could come to life from Phazon alone is astonishing. After all, there are a ton of inanimate objects out there, and we see Phazon interact with lots of them, whether it's directly or indirectly, so seeing a couple of rocks turning into something like Thardus is unbelievable. A great amount of Phazon was indeed needed for this to be possible, but the fact that a Phazon core alone was capable of becoming Thardus is still quite remarkable. With this in mind, each fight sees Samus shooting at its Phazon core to slowly weaken it until it's defeated. However, this Phazon core will be inside of its body, and thus the only way to know which parts are vulnerable is by using the recently acquired thermal visor, which highlights the Phazon core. But mainly because of its origin, Thardus deserves a spot in this video. But the Space Pirates aren't the only ones who run questionable experiments, since the Chozo were guilty of this with Experiment C-57. Experiment C-57 resembles another boss creature from the game, Corpius, but it seems to be genetically altered in some way. And it is through the Chozo archives that we get the answer for that, since multiple images depict the events that transpire in CDR. From this, however, we'll only need to analyze the 5th and 3rd Chozo archive. In the 5th one, a Corpius specimen is shown lying on the ground, defeated presumably by the Chozo soldiers standing around it. And then, in the 3rd one, C-57 is actually depicted in a hibernation pod, being monitored by Quiet Robe. Tying all of this together, it's safe to assume that Experiment C-57 was one of the Mawkin's many bioweapons, most likely created with Corpius as a basis. However, things don't end here, since the build-up to the boss fight also tells us more about this specimen. You'll first encounter it in this particular room, but it will go unnoticed due to the lack of light. However, once you restore the power to Draygon, that same room will be lit, and you will be able to witness a most likely unresponsive Experiment C-57. The machine twitches sporadically, but no signs of life will be shown aside from the occasional muzzle reflex to the dischargers. However, further into the game, and after exiting Ellen for the first time, you'll eventually have to make your way to Kataris through Draygon, where the temperature will have been lowered. By the time you get to C-57's room, it will be nowhere to be seen. It's not until you reach the thermal reactor in Kataris that you will finally encounter Experiment C-57 in all its glory. And things don't end here, since the boss fight itself contains a quirk. By this point, you'll have the speed booster in your arsenal. This usually doesn't get any use outside of puzzles of room traversal, but if you manage to start a speed booster at the beginning of this particular move and manage to maintain it until the move ends, and carry the Shine Spark all the way to C-57's head, you can instantly defeat it. This isn't the only instance of a quick method of defeating bosses in Dread, but it's a really unique mechanic nonetheless. That unique technique and the boss's backstory is what makes it land on the list. And speaking of creatures with interesting origins, the next boss is none other than a final boss. During Metroid Prime Hunters ending, Samus collects every octolith to enter the Oubliette, where a malevolent creature was sealed. There, all of the hunters are having their energy absorbed by a creature, all of the hunters hitting the floor in unison. This creature was none other than Gorea itself. Very little is known about Gorea, but there are quite a lot of theories concerning its origin. However, there's a lot to talk about mechanically, since the boss fight consists of two different phases. The first phase sees Samus fighting Gorea in a type of circular arena. Upon shooting Gorea normally, it will seemingly be invulnerable to any type of damage, while simultaneously changing colors and weapons. However, if you're keen, you will notice how there's two colors in Gorea's colors, the one from the weapon it's using and what's considered to be the polar opposite. Now, if you were to equip the opposite weapon to Gorea's and shoot at it, it will take damage. This is how you defeat Gorea, very similar to the final boss in Metroid Prime. However, if you were to defeat Gorea normally, the game would simply end. However, upon closer inspecting the arena, you will notice some colored panels. You can shoot at them, but they normally won't react, unless you shoot them with the correct weapon, that is. If you shoot at them with a weapon of the same color as the panel, they will spin accordingly. However, it's not that easy to do so, since you need to follow a specific order. The logbook for the Alembic prophecy states, "It is written that the Alembic power shall materialize when 6 frequencies shimmer in the divine spectral sequence. In the beginning shall the darkness be torn asunder by a flash of yellow lightning. Yellow lightning shall strike with demonic fury upon the greenwood. With a voice of thunder shall the greenwood burst into an orange blaze. The orange blaze shall die away to be reborn on wings of blue smoke. Tendrils of blue smoke shall weave the geometry of violet crystal. Violet crystal shall shatter the heavens, leaving in its wake a red stain. When the red stain shall vanish, so shall the ancient Alembic power be manifest." This means that the proper order would be to use the bolt driver, then the battle hammer, then the Mahmol, then the shock coil, then the Judicator, and finally the Imperialist. If done correctly, this will unlock the true final boss, where Samus will be able to defeat Gorea in its purest form, for good. In this second form, Gorea will float around while shooting at Samus. However, here Samus will get access to the weapon capable of defeating Gorea, the Omega Cannon, a weapon sealed for its unstable and great power. The weapon can actually damage Samus herself if the explosion radius were to hit her, so she must be careful dealing with it. However, Gorea might be one of the most interesting beings thanks to its lore. Not much is known about it, but there's just enough evidence in Hunters to relate it directly from something that is seemingly missing from Hunters, Phazon. To keep things straight to the point, Gorea's arrival in a meteorite, its abilities and the fact that it got sealed away due to the danger it proved to the Limbic Society is very reminiscent to other space societies like the Chozo or the Luminoth, which is why it's not crazy to believe that Gorea was a gaseous manifestation of Phazon. Because of all of the things that were listed, Gorea finds its way into this list. However, Gorea isn't the only strange boss from Hunters. In fact, the creature doesn't even originate in Hunters, but rather possibly the most obscure game in the whole franchise. It can only be encountered in Metroid Prime Hunters First Hunt, the demo for the game. In this particular entry, there are many modes you can try it out. From the single player options, there are 3 modes available: Regulator, Survivor, and Morph Ball. For this video, however, we'll only be taking a look at Regulator. In Regulator, you will be tasked with clearing 12 rooms in less than 10 minutes, similar to what an arena might look like. However, the enemies included in this arena are the ones we're interested in, the Xenomorphs. Xenomorphs are holographic creatures that can take the form of any other creature, such as Moxdroids, Metroids, or Summers. In order to reach the end in Regulator, you'll need to defeat waves of these 3 different variants over the course of 11 rooms. However, the last room will be a bit different. You see, Xenomorphs can take the form of both regular enemies and bosses. So instead of a wave of enemies, the Xenomorph will take a boss-like form that only makes an appearance in this game, the Samus's doppelganger. This copy of Samus will utilize your own tools against you, similarly to how the Hunters work in the final game. However, while there have been many Samus counterparts in the past, it's unusual for a game to have unique content exclusively for the demo, making Samus's doppelganger Xenomorph extremely unique. And finally, talking about bosses with complex origins, we move on to Echoes, where we can find the only optional boss in the whole Metroid franchise. To reach it, Samus will have to go back to the landing site and drop from the same hole she dropped from at the beginning of the game. There, she will be met with a horrifying sight. One of the Dark Troopers will seem to have survived their skirmish from the beginning of the game. However, this time their moveset will be slightly different. Instead of simply using their regular beam like their peers, this Dark Missile Trooper will utilize missiles against Samus. However, because of their health being extremely low, they will go down rather easily, revealing the upgrade they were guarding, a pack of missiles. But its non-mandatory nature isn't the only interesting thing about this entry, since this missile pack that they drop is slightly different from the rest. If you take a closer look at them, you will notice how these missiles are identical to the first missile upgrade you get in Metroid Prime 1. And this is because this, unlike the other missile expansions, is the missile launcher itself, the first missile upgrade you're supposed to collect in other games normally. This means that this ink-infected boss was the one in charge of guarding the missile launcher, but given the nature of missiles, this didn't stop Samus from obtaining ammo. Still, being the only optional boss in a Metroid game and guarding an upgrade you were supposed to collect much earlier in the game is the reason why the Dark Missile Trooper is one of the weirdest Metroid bosses ever. And those were some of the weirdest Metroid bosses. When it comes to Metroid, there's probably no such thing as a normal creature, just different stages of weird. Hence why these videos are always so fun to make. You could literally make the argument for almost any boss in the franchise making it into this list, and it would still make sense. But these are the ones that I personally consider. Let me know if you would have fathered another boss, or if you'd like to see a specific type of video in the future in the comments below. I've been Ambercore, and it's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you.